Hello, I'm Robert, and this is to help you, it's to counteract this idea that we just don't need to do anything, and eventually COVID will get mild like a cold in just a few months. And this has been shared as a good news story on the internet. But sadly, this is looking at it with rosy spectacles. And there's no basis for that. But we can make it so. We can make it so it's no longer a public health measure. By using vaccines, by using therapeutics, and by using public health measures, we can end it as a serious global health emergency sometime next year. But it's not going to happen by itself. And even the expert they quoted, Professor Sarah Gilbert, all she said is that that she thinks that eventually it's going to become a mild disease like the four other human coronaviruses. She didn't give a timescale of years, decades, or even centuries. She just didn't say. And but other expert reactions. She's not an expert on the evolution of viruses. She makes vaccines, expert on the development of vaccines. This is a virologist, Dr. Angela Rasmussen, and she says with much respect, she just doesn't agree with this. That viruses don't always become attenuated, less virulent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those two theories and why and what the basis is. But meanwhile, and this is Dr. Maria van Kerkhove, and she says, and she hasn't got involved in this debate at all. She just a tweet from her today saying that we can drastically reduce hospitalizations and deaths from COVID, and talk about good thing we have the tools, we need to use them, and we can do this. And so some things I'll also bring up in this video, we can easily tweak the COVID vaccines. So some of you who are maybe think it's being a bit like antibiotics, vaccines are very different from antibiotics. It takes a decade to develop a new antibiotic. With the COVID, then to tweak we get new vaccine for flu every year. We can do the same for COVID in just 3 months. And flu is very unusual in being able to evade vaccines every year. And they don't expect COVID to be able to do that once we get the good enough vaccines. Most viruses can't evade vaccines at all. They just never manage it. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. And then from these variants, the experts don't expect a new variant to suddenly be able to evade the vaccines all in one go. They expect that there could be a little bit more evasion than there has been already. And that's about what the worst we can expect from the next variant. So it's not like suddenly your vaccines won't work. And the WHO said we don't need to live with the virus, we can keep cases low, and we don't need to have any cases. That's my example, measles, not their example. I'll talk a bit about that, and how the endemic cases may eventually be in specific geographic areas, not necessarily everywhere all the time. So I'm going to talk about that. But first of all, let's talk about this bit. So this basically is the theory. Sorry, that's a slightly messy diagram, but I hope you can see. So the basic theory is there's one of the codes called OC43, and by the molecular clock, it crosses over in 1890. There happened to be a pandemic at the same time, and they say, suppose that pandemic was OC43, and that might mean OC43 became very mild very quickly in just a few years. It's all ifs and buts. And they give some evidence, well, I'll come to that in a bit, it's not very strong evidence that it was OC43. In fact, they got antibodies to H2N2 flu were detected in people who lived through that pandemic. So that's not very strong evidence. And then we have another one called HKU1 or something, and that one has actually crossed over in 1950, and there was no associated pandemic with that one. So that one seems to be mild all along. So this evidence is really quite weak, and I'll go into that in a little bit more. And then the only other ones are these two ones here, 229E and NL63. And these, if they were originally serious, then they have been around since the 12th century, 1100, and they could have been, even if they were serious, they could have taken centuries to become weak. And again, we don't know, they could have been weak. They seem to have a common ancestor. It might just be that by chance the three coronaviruses that crossed to humans and are still there or all originally weak. We don't know that. It's not a very big sample. So that's basically their evidence, though. And it's not very strong evidence. And then they have the idea that COVID might evolve to infect the upper respiratory tract and become a milder disease. But so far that hasn't happened. So Delta went up and get very strong in the upper respiratory tract. It got no milder. So there's much more virus in the upper respiratory tract. At the same time, there's a lot of virus still in the lower respiratory tract, and it goes all the way through your body and all the organs, just like all the previous versions. So again, that's a very weak argument, because why would it get, if it goes up into the upper respiratory tract, why would it get out of the lower respiratory tract? So as you can see, I've read both papers. This is a much shorter paper. It doesn't go into much detail, and I find the arguments quite weak. And the other one is much more carefully thought out. So I'm going to into a little bit more detail. So this is about how they crossed over, and how in 1950, that's the one that crossed over around 1950, and they did a back projection. They said, suppose that HKU1 was as serious as COVID. Now you look at, and this is France and that's USA, they would have had 3 cases looking at the age profile, going back to the age pyramid to what cases you would expect if it was like it is today. They would expect 3 people in 1,000 to die in those 2 countries. Another one's with 1 in 1,000, United Kingdom. But those are levels that they reckon, well, even though their science was much less advanced than we have now, they think that in the early 1950s we would have noticed a pandemic that killed 3 in 1,000 in the United States and France, and 1 in 1,000 in the other countries. And we would have noticed that it wasn't flu, and noticed it happening. And they just didn't find, we would have noticed the pandemic, and they just didn't find the pandemic. They just found no signs of a pandemic in the 1950s that could be HKU1. So they don't see any evidence that HKU1 is ever serious. And as we see, the OC43, that rather falls apart. If you go and look, this is my section on OC43. If you actually read the paper, it says they actually refer to this study that found antibodies to H2N2 flu in these survivors. They've been about in their late 60s, early 70s, and upwards, still around. The ones who were born would be 68, and then the others, elderly people, in 1957, and they had an H2N2 flu pandemic immediately afterwards, and they checked that against the previous antibodies and blood sera collected before that, and they, using the best science they had at the time, it seemed that they had the same kinds of antibodies. So it looked like it was 1989 pandemic was H2N2. And so this paper just continues. However, they say that, and then they say, however, it's tempting to speculate that the pandemic could have been OC43. And then another argument is that central nervous systems, they were quite pronounced in that epidemic. But that is not a very strong argument, because influenza outbreaks, especially when they first jump to human beings from animals, then they often do have pronounced central nervous systems as well. There's a whole list of those central nervous systems symptoms, diseases, symptoms that you can have from H2N, from influenza jumping to humans. So the more I look at it, the weaker it seems as an argument. I'm no expert, and you can go and have a look for yourself and think. But go and have a read of that paper. It's full of lots of ifs and buts. It's not that convincing. And what Angela Rasmussen said, she talked about how there's no evolutionary pressure, or very little evolutionary pressure for COVID to become milder and less serious. And the reason is that it's most infectious. It's got a very long incubation period. It's got a long incubation period, and then once you get the symptoms, it's got a very long period until you start having to go to hospital. It's quite unusual in that respect. It's only in the second week usually after 14 days. Most deaths have to happen after 14 days. And you can be in hospital, most of the infection happens before you go into hospital, just at the start of when you're in hospital. So there isn't really much pressure to, if the evolution favours it becoming more infectious, the virus isn't a thinking thing. And it's not going to say, oh, well, this bit of evil, I've got to evolve in such a way as to be infectious and not become virulent. If there's no downside to being more virulent as it becomes more infectious, then if being more infectious makes you more virulent, the virus will still do it, because there's no downside to it for the virus, because the deaths happen long after it was infecting people. So this is what she's saying. Nowadays we think of a trade-off, and there's no trade-off in terms of infection and death for COVID. You look at the trade-off for particular diseases. So for some diseases there is a trade-off with dying. There isn't for COVID or for serious disease. So that's why they say, it could become more virulent. And if you look at the things that have happened so far with alpha and D614G, alpha and delta, the things that have made them more infectious have also made them more serious. And she points out that lots of complex interactions with the body. It's not just the spike protein. And so I had to look at some of the details here. It's incredibly complex what the virus does when it comes into your body. Just one of the things it does that no other disease. I'll just talk first of all about the three things that alpha did. That they did make it be able to stick into the, they did two things to do with the spike protein, which made it more able to get into a new cell. Both alpha and delta, this is also a spike protein change, but a different one. They both modified the furin cleavage site, and this is. But then alpha did one of the things that alpha did. It modified the production of interferon, and that's nothing to do with the spike protein. It made it more difficult for the cell to produce interferon to alert other cells to the disease. So that's an example of a change that has already happened. It wasn't anything to do with the spike protein. And the furin cleavage site thing, then that was to do with spike protein. So, but there are lots of things, and if you go and look at the details of what happened, the spike protein is a big complex thing too. And if you look at the details of what actually happens when it infects the cells, it's absolutely hugely complicated. This virus does far more. It disables your immune system. So there's one particular enzyme it produces, which it actually labels all the messenger RNA that belongs to the virus with a particular label. Then this enzyme goes around and snips any messenger RNA it finds in the cell that hasn't got that label on it. It also goes and it blocks the entrance to the ribosomes. So the ribosomes transmit RNA into enzymes and things, proteins and things, and the virus blocks the entrance to the ribosome, so it can't do that. It also blocks the exit to the nucleus of the cell, so that you've got these little exits for the messenger RNA to come out of the nucleus, so no messenger RNA could come out of the nucleus. And this virus also, it co-opts the Golgi apparatus. Golgi, I don't know if I'm not an expert, as you can guess, but this thing that it's, I think it's Golgi apparatus, which sends, it basically packages enzymes and stuff and sends it throughout the cell. And the virus co-opts that and uses that to package the virus and send that and make that. It uses this apparatus to make the virus. And it also uses the lysosomes, which are things that kind of rubbish bags that get thrown out of the cell. And it goes into one of these rubbish bags and turns it into a virus, and or a virus producing thing. And that's where actually the furin cleavage site thing. So most viruses just bud out of the cell wall. But COVID doesn't do that. The SARS-CoV-2 virus, it has this different way of making the virus, and it's quite slow. So something could speed that up, for instance, and make it just a little bit faster. That would be one way that it could be more infectious. And the alpha variant, the alpha and delta one, they modified the purine cleavage site, so it could be, once it's made the bits of the body of the virus, it goes into these little packages. Then after it does that, it then snips a little bit of it, of the virus, which makes it more infectious for entering the next cell. And alpha, and alpha and delta, I think both, it was in that list, so I'll have to read it, they both changed the purine cleavage site in order to make it just a little bit, yes, both alpha and delta modified the purine cleavage site to make it more easily snippable, which means that more of the virus gets out of the cell in a more infectious state, ready to infect another cell. Another thing that this virus does is that as it's being made in the cell, it sends lots of its spikes just sticking out of spikes out of the cell wall. But they're not viruses, they're just the spikes. And these spikes then modify the way the cell wall works to make it sticky. So that's another funny thing that the spikes do. The spikes make the cell wall sticky. And then the cells stick to each other. And it's a bit like the way muscles form. So you get these you get these big kind of conglomerates, lots of cells that fuse together, and they just become one big cell wall around them all, with up to 20 nucleuses inside. And then makes it very resilient to being attacked, because if any killer cells come and try and attack that factory, they just stick to it, and then they make the killer cells into more virus-producing machinery. And so this virus has been really very good at converting cells into quite big chunks of cells into virus-producing factories. And if you want to, and if the virus gets more transmissible, you might well do that by getting better at that, which is obviously going to make it more virulent. So if you look at all this, there doesn't seem to be anything in all this way that the virus is working to suggest that any of these things, if it gets better at this, if it gets better at stopping your immune system from noticing it, it gets better at sticking cells together, it gets better infecting other cells and so on, why would any of these changes make it less virulent? So far, the changes have all made it more virulent. So then there's the idea, well, if it becomes more transmissible in the upper respiratory tract, and as I said, the theory is it might kind of migrate from the lower respiratory tract up to and specialise in the upper respiratory tract, like our cold viruses have done. But for whatever was the reason that our cold viruses do that, doesn't at present seem to be an evolutionary pressure for COVID to do that, for SARS-CoV-2 to do that. So they're just using an analogy of a cold virus isn't very persuasive when you can't see how that analogy will work with COVID. We're just using an analogy of a different virus, and they haven't actually seen a cold virus evolve. It might have always just infected the upper respiratory tract as well. Again, we don't know. So there's certainly advantages to infect the upper respiratory tract. Our immune system is much weaker there, and it's also very ready in just the right place to be sneezed and coughed out to infect other people. So it's certainly good as far as the virus evolution to infect up there. The real question is why we just stop infecting further down when it gets better infecting higher up. And then there's one variant, this one B1427, B1429, and this variant has actually was spreading in France, and they think that the reason it was winning out in the evolutionary pressure there might have been because it was evading swabs. So that is an evolutionary pressure that we are imposing on it by doing lots of testing using nasal swabs. Then if the virus can manage to get to other people but kind of hide and not be very much of it in the upper, in the nasal cavity especially, then that could be an evolutionary advantage. So it evades the swabs, and yet still enough it gets out to infect people, maybe through coughs or whatever. Anyway, I don't know for whatever reason, I'm not sure how this one, sorry, that's the interpolation, I shouldn't do that. So it just seemed to be some pressure of it avoiding the upper respiratory tract. There might be future pressure for that to happen. And again, that would not necessarily be very helpful in terms of it becoming more serious. And so then another idea is maybe it'll become less serious if it, because it infects kids, then by the time they're adults, they get much less serious versions of it. Now, if that is true, then that's for the very far future, because our kids are not going to be adults for quite long. They're not going to be especially 60 and 80 and so on. Children are being infected now. Maybe by the end of the century, they'll have very weak COVID reactions. But if you look at the other way, then so far the evidence is very much against this too, because of long COVID. And we have there's some. It's not. Hopefully it is. But we have kids who get, a small minority, get shrinking some of the grey matter in their brains, especially associated with taste and smell, and with shortened memory and cognition, is shrinks as a result of being infected. Just some of them. Most don't. If you've got a kid who get infected, it's very unlikely this happens to them. It has happened to some of them, and this could, and then this is very similar to what happens in early stage of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So they don't think. So hopefully it's not going to be like those, and there's no reason to expect to be progressive disease is going to get worse. But they worry especially for people who are susceptible, those who have elderly life and so on, that it might be a factor that affects them. So for kids, and they're worrying, what's going to happen long term, and they don't know yet, because the brain is quite slow at healing. The experts are kind of optimistic that the long COVID symptoms, some long COVID symptoms like lack of sense of taste and smell and hazy, fuzzy thinking, have continued for a year and a half for some people. They're hopeful that they will be over in 3 years. But with that background, again, it's very kind of optimistic to say, it's if kids get it, it's not mild for kids really. It's not like colds are. It's not like there's potential. It's maybe more serious than we realise for kids. And that's not sorry, that bit is not in the paper that I read. That little bit about it being more serious for kids. But the paper talked about reinfection of kids. It doesn't talk about long COVID, as far as I can see. But it does. So that's my interpolation. But what the paper does talk about is it says that there's no real reason to expect that reinfection of kids is necessarily, once you've got your variants and everything, that they're not going to be serious. So it's not. We've got the example of OC43 where you have adults and if they haven't been exposed to it, they get much more serious. But there just isn't enough evidence to say that as it varies and it reinfects kids, that it is going to become mild as they get adult. They just didn't find very strong evidence for that. Because the greatest unknown appears to rest in immune escape. And the problem is that if you've got people who are immune to one version of it, then how is it going to escape? And is that immune escape going to make it milder? And it's not absolutely clear that it would. So again, you just got the analogy from colds, but it's not clear from looking at the special case of COVID that it is going to be milder when it escapes the immune system for kids. So all of these things, then it's not clear that it is going to become mild for any. It is going to come mild, and even whether subsequent waves of new variants will necessarily be milder than when they go through the population again. Once the natural immunity wears off, and they're not certain that new waves of the pandemic would be milder. So it's really it's like rosy spectacles thinking in a way. So it would be. They're not saying that it won't be milder. It could be. It could evolve to be milder, but they don't see the evolutionary pressure there that makes it a convincing case that it definitely will evolve to be milder. So that's the situation. So far, it's become more serious, and they don't see, and they see nothing in the evolutionary pressure to be pushing it to go the other way. They might go the other way, but they don't see it in science of COVID itself. So it's not saying it's definitely going to become more serious. So don't get that message from this. And but they're not saying it, but they're saying we can't say it's definitely going to get more mild. And so far it's got slightly more serious with each new variant. So they're saying, well, basically, in the absence of any kind of signs that can actually tell us for sure what's going to happen next, the best guess is the next variant is likely to continue the same trend and become slightly more serious again. Not hugely more, but slightly more. Now I'm going to talk about how the vaccines are going to are really helping. Are going to the way that, so it's not going to become mild by itself. There's not just wishful thinking in a way. It might, but it doesn't seem very likely at all at present. And but we can make it mild. So that's what the second half of this is about. So first of all, this shows what a huge difference the vaccines have made in making it mild in the United Kingdom, where I live. And this graph, some people find it a little bit confusing. It's using two different scales. The cases are in orange, and that's shown to the right there. And so those in the tens of thousands, and then these in the hundreds to the thousand are the deaths, and that's on the left. So you read these numbers off that way, those numbers off that way, and it's been scaled so the deaths go to the same height as the cases. So the very low number of cases here, because there's very little testing back then. So there were probably just as many cases back then, they just didn't detect them. And so now if you go and look at the deaths here, because they only tested people in hospital, and only if they had an overnight stay with COVID in the hospital, those were the only people being tested back then in the United Kingdom. So now, if you look up here, and they've scaled it, so those are the deaths for those cases. And then if it was the same ratio as it was back then, we should see the same here, and we can see the deaths are greatly reduced compared to the same number of cases. We've got that number of cases, it should be that number of deaths, but instead it's way down here. So there's absolutely no doubt that the vaccine make a huge difference to the deaths, which we saw also from the clinical trials, and we now see it in the real world data in the United Kingdom, where there's very low vaccine hesitancy, especially amongst the very elderly and the most susceptible, and they're all getting vaccinated. Very, very high level of vaccination, well over 90% in the most vulnerable groups. So, and then hospitalization is not such a big fall. That's partly because Delta has become more severe. So Delta seems to have increased the hospitalization, but not the deaths. So it's not more deadly, but it's more serious. And so, but we still got a huge reduction in the hospitalization. And then this Dr. Maria van Kerkhove, and she's saying that she has to say, I don't like this phrase, living with the virus. This is my shortened version for autistic people. Autistic people, they have a different way of processing language, slightly different, where they like sentences that are the same structure, simple structure, straightforward sentences, and like lots and lots of details. And autistic people can easily handle huge numbers of details, but each detail kind of simple structure to it. Whereas the neurotypical people, they like long, complicated sentences. They like sentences continually changing structure and changing, a little bit varied from one to the other, because it's kind of very social kind of thing. So I take I take these longer, complicated and rearranging and kind of creative sentences, and I turn them into more ones that autistic people find easier to understand. So easier to connect to. And so we already have the tools to drive transmission down so low, and we can minimize deaths. I'm not an expert on autism, but I spend hours every day talking to autistic people over the internet, because they're the people who get most scared by these scenarios. And I think I might be slightly autistic myself. I've never been diagnosed, but I can certainly understand and got a sympathy understand from my own way of looking at the world. I get kind of feeling of understanding some of the things that they're dealing with. Anyway, so we already have the tools to drive transmission down so low, and we can minimize the deaths if we can get the vaccine to the right people. We just haven't used them properly. And so it might become endemic, but it may become endemic, but when you hear endemic, you think endemic like flu. So I want to explain about how endemic doesn't mean huge numbers of cases like flu. And it could be in specific areas and not everywhere all the time, drive transmission way down. That's what we can do. And for the time being, we need to do it all. So this Swiss cheese thing, where most of you will have heard about this already, so I'm not going to go into that here, but just doing everything else like physical distancing, mask wearing, test, trace, isolate, and so on. And so I want to talk about the vaccines and how you get the idea that we have reached the limit of development of the vaccines. There's almost no news about the new vaccines that are underway. And many people I talk to would be utterly surprised to know how many vaccines we've actually got in clinical trials right now. Let's scroll down and show you. And find the numbers. There we are. We've got 35 vaccines in phase 3. It's absolutely incredible. Never had anything like this for any previous virus. 35 different vaccines, all in phase 3 in the final trials right now. Far more than there were in December. And so most people just don't have a clue about that. And that is really, we're going to see huge changes. We're going to get many more vaccines approved. If we have a similar approval rate to what we've had so far, we may well have over 30 new vaccines by the time those clinical trials end, phase 3 trials sometime early 2022. What will the situation be like with another 2 or 3 dozen new vaccines, with all new ideas and different ideas being explored. And flu is the only deadly disease that evades vaccines every year. Look at this, all these other ones, they don't. And the reason vaccines, I talked already about how vaccines find it hard, that it's easier to evade antibiotics, and it's very difficult to develop an antibiotic that can stop an antibiotic-resistant mutation, because the drug has antibiotics typically has one binding site, and then if the microbe can modify that binding site, well, whatever it is the antibiotic isn't attacking, and some of them might even have that naturally already, then they've evaded it, or they've greatly reduced the effect of the antibiotic. And once you've got a few, then you start getting the evolutionary pressure to get better and better at evading the antibiotic. But now, if you look at it with vaccines, then with the exception of flu, then it's very rare for a vaccine to evade virus to evade the vaccine, because you have lots of antibodies. Most vaccines trigger lots of antibodies, and when the virus evades, they can get that latch onto these things called epitopes on the antigen, which start the virus, whatever it's, all the things about the machinery that's involved. And as you get resistant mutation, you might be able to change one of these little features, say on the spike protein, so the antibodies don't latch onto it anymore, they don't notice it. There'll be another couple that they still latch onto. And so this is why it was no surprise we only got slight evasion with alpha and delta, because you don't expect all of them to evade at once. In fact, it's not just 3 antibodies, there's dozens of them, lots of different antibodies latching on in slightly different ways, different bits of the virus. And so very hard for the virus to evade them. And it's just kind of schematic showing the idea. And it's quite a few different binding sites and lots of antibodies. And so that makes it very hard for viruses to evade vaccines. The problem is there isn't really much advantage to just evading one antibody or one group of antibodies that's clustered onto a particular area that you can manage to evade. So the flu is very, very special. It's got 8 segments in it, and they're called negative sense RNA. That means that each segment it works a little bit like DNA. It can't directly make proteins. The segments then make messenger RNA, which then makes the proteins. And whereas the COVID, and like other coronaviruses, has only got one long sense strand of positive sense RNA, which means it can make the proteins directly without having to first translate it to messenger RNA. It doesn't need that translation step. Anyway, so the flu virus, but it's got these 8 segments. It can take one of these segments and replace it with another flu virus. So when you get a flu virus jumps onto humans for the first time, and it's the first time it's encountered humans, but there's lots of other flu viruses circulating around at the same time. From time to time, it'll manage to infect the same cell and within the same person with another flu virus, and it'll get some of the capabilities of another flu virus. So flu can evolve very quickly, and then it can evolve very quickly to evade vaccines. Because in the same way, you have a vaccine that targets one of these, well, it might swap that out for another flu virus that is circulating around that doesn't have that particular bit in it. Whatever it is, it's not that particularly what it genetically encodes, and it might just swap it out for another one that makes the virus a little bit different. So this is not expected to happen with COVID. So COVID is much more likely to is much more amenable to vaccines. It does evolve rather quickly, but it doesn't have this special system that flu has that lets it evade so quickly. So it's entirely feasible. And I did this graphic to kind of show the idea that it's like using analogies for colds, and now people usually use the analogy of flu. An awful lot of people just argue, well, it's going to be like this because we've got the experience of all the previous flu pandemics, and that's what happened. But COVID is not a flu virus, it's not even remotely related to it. It's about as closely related to a flu virus, say, and just give it a kind of figurative way of putting it, as a hedgehog is to a cow. You're expecting flu to behave like COVID. It's like expecting a cow to behave like a hedgehog, because they're both mammals. What all they have in common is they're both viruses, and both respiratory viruses, and they cross over from animals. And there isn't really too much more in common. I don't know how far back you have to go for their common ancestor, if they have one. It'd be a long time ago, because they're completely different types of virus. It's like trying to look for the common ancestor of a hedgehog and a cow. If you try to find a common ancestor of COVID and flu, you probably have to go back a long way. This is about how we've got lots of vaccines in development, and right now it's in the news a lot about how we've got the booster program in the United States and in UK where I am, and saying this is going to impact on the vaccines in the third world. But now if we look in the I'm just trying to think about what sequence to the rest of what I'm going to talk about. I'll continue with the vaccines, and then I'll go back to, and what I'm going to talk about last is about how we got rid of just about all the hyper-endemic viruses. Flu is the only one left. So, and we might eventually get rid of flu. Anyway, if we look at this, then Novavax and all the rest are endemic but very low level. Anyway, first let's talk about this, about the vaccines that are coming along. And Novavax is going to be the first vaccine. It's with the World Health Organization at the moment. They are evaluating it for approval, and it may well be approved. I have no idea what the progress is. It just seems to be stuck at the moment. They're waiting for data, but they've got a 1.35 billion. Their biggest pre-order is for COVAX, so it completely turns around with the other ones. And this is going to be the situation, I think, for the vaccines coming along now, because the wealthy countries, they're saying we're going to live with the virus. They're not really all that concerned about finding better viruses. They think they've got it already. They just want more Pfizer, more Moderna, more AstraZeneca, and they're not really doing much to kind of stimulate these. This is being, it's really CEPI and COVAX that's driving the demand for vaccines now. So we can expect that the very best vaccines, because the second and third generations are likely to be better than the previous ones, and they're going to be with COVAX. Well, that's what it seems like to me. way I'm looking at it now. So, I mean, by early 1922, we'll have the best vaccines starting to be rolled out to the weaker economies first, quite possibly. And we'll see what happens. But for instance, COVAX, CEPI is funding Gritstone Bio. And this is a second generation vaccine. And remember I talked about all the bits of the virus. When it forms inside the cell, it's really messy how it's not like how you make a machine, but it's sort of like you have a factory with all the bits lying around on benches and you get them together. It spontaneously forms inside the cell. So you've got all these components inside the cell. They're just sort of messy lying around inside the cell. And then you have the killer T cells, and these recognize the virus innards. And so the Gritstone Bio is going to expose some of the bits, the innards of the virus. And it's going to make those, as well as making the spikes. It's going to do both. And so the killer T cells, if you've got immunocompromised, especially like you've got drugs to suppress your antibodies, you'll still have the killer T cells. So Gritstone Bio is potentially a vaccine for immunocompromised people to be able to use and to be much stronger for them. And it's got this double whammy of it's looking at innards which change much more difficult, with greater difficulty. The bits that form inside the cells before the virus is quite ready to go off and start infecting other cells. And so the killer T cells are going to be able to attack the innards of the virus and kill the cells that are making the virus, these big virus factories, and kill them before before they start forming these big virus factories. Kill them very early on. They spot the innards, so potentially it might be quite a good vaccine stopping COVID early. And then you've also got it's also going to be stopping the antibodies, and we've got the Hexapro tweak for the stopping the spike. It present the spikes. We've got this Hexapro tweak, which makes the spikes much more. It stabilizes the spikes because the virus it's a shift changer. It's constantly changing the shape of its spike, so it's not easy to recognize. And the vaccines fix it into one particular position that is just before it enters the cell, and antibodies, if they recognize that, can stop the virus from entering cells. So by making the shift shape of the spike into a constant spike that doesn't change shape, and that also, and this is a stronger, we've got the 2p tweak for Moderna and Pfizer, but this is an even better one called the Hexapro tweak. And this is licensed for free to the weaker economies. And so there's lots of vaccines coming along that expect to be better. So the second and third generation vaccines, they should be stable at higher temperatures, may even eventually room temperatures, certainly in a fridge. And they are also going to be easier to deliver. Some of them will be nasal sprays, so they don't need to be injected. They're going to give a stronger immune reaction, probably, and they may well stop more transmission than the vaccines we have already. So with all that going on, look at the huge numbers that I mentioned, more than, there you are, you've got 35 in phase 3 and you've got 54 in phase 1. Gritstone Bio is one of the many innovative ones in phase 1. And when those start getting up, and unusually, nearly all the phase 1 vaccines go all the way to phase 3. So we may well have 54 in phase 3 sometime in 2022. And some of those very innovative ones, like Gritstone Bio. And the demand is certainly going to be continuing. And so I'm very helpful and then hopeful about this. And as for delivering it to the world, then the numbers, we already are producing 1 billion a month. And it's going up to maybe 1.5 billion a month quite soon. But by next year, we will have enough for by the end of 2022, and even without some of the new methods of making vaccines which make it much easier to make, such as them growing in hen's eggs, and that will make the vaccines even easier to make. But even not taking account of that, then we should be able to make enough vaccines for everyone in the world in just 3 months to make it out towards the end of 2022. So we could basically vaccinate the entire world with a much more effective vaccine. than we have now, if we're lucky. If one of these 54 in phase 1 and one of the ones in phase 3 happens to be a better vaccine than the ones we have so far. And surely it would be extraordinarily surprising if Pfizer, the very first vaccine to be approved, happened to hit on the very best possible vaccine that you could have for COVID. That seems extremely unlikely. So surely we're going to have better vaccines come along than Pfizer. I can punctuate the second and third generation vaccine. So two ways of looking at it, both in terms of the technical, that the way they are doing it looks like it should make it better, and also just even Pfizer, it's very unlikely that the particular dose and regime they started off with is the optimal, the very best way they can be delivered, leading the best immune response. So we can't stop COVID with our current vaccines alone. We need to continue to do it all, but in the future we have these second and third generation vaccines, and then we also have we can continue with mass testing, which we've never done before with trying to stop the disease. So we can do surge testing whenever there's an outbreak anywhere. We could surge test everyone in that city and isolate anyone who's got COVID. We've never tried to stop a disease like that before. And then we can also do the test, trace, isolate. And again, it's been clear with this pandemic that that's been underutilized in the past. It's something we can do at a scale that nobody realized was quite realized was possible before, until China did it. So we can do very large scale. So we have lots of tools that we can do, but even if it wasn't quite effective enough to stop it with just the vaccine, add all that on top, and that tips it over. But we may well have vaccines that are, if your vaccine is better than 90%, I mean, say it was if it was better than 90%, then that gets you up to 9 out of 10. If it's 95%, it's 9 out of 20. And then and at the moment it's 5 to 8, it's not likely to go all the way up to 20. I mean, measles is 18. And then, of course, you've got the vaccine hesitant, and you've got the few percent that don't. But you can't actually get better than the yellow fever vaccine is 99% effective. So you can get very effective vaccines sometimes. And so, endemic, it doesn't. So now I'm going to talk about the endemic, and endemic doesn't need to mean high numbers of deaths. We used to have many endemic diseases. First of all, it used to be that half the children, around about half children, sometimes in some countries a lot more, some countries less, go back to the 19th century, and they died before they reached, before age 15. So you only had a 50-50 chance if you were a baby of going all the way to adulthood, if you were in Victorian England. And that's gone down hugely, down, and it's now 4.6%, but it is even less in the stronger economies. And many of those deaths were due to infectious diseases. We had a rate in 1900, 8 in 100 people were dying of infectious diseases every year. 8 in 100. That's quite a lot. It seriously impact on your life expectancy. And we can go and look at somewhere I've got a list of the top ones. There we are. And that includes things like tuberculosis and influenza. There was polio was there, smallpox was there, and this that's how many were dying of infectious diseases in 1900, and that is all gone down to this number, which is much less. This is influenza plus pneumonia, so this is much less. So it's a little bit mixed up, which they didn't divide it up, but it's far less down there. Just a tiny little fraction down there. That's all that's left of all that. And so influenza is the only remaining so there used to be huge numbers of deaths from many different very serious diseases every year. Influenza is the only remaining hyperendemic disease. So when people say, oh, COVID is now deadly, so it's going to become hyperendemic, why? Why would it be when all the other ones we've got rid of and it's only flu that's left? So doesn't seem that's not a very good reason to believe it's going to be endemic. And the ones that are deadly, they're going down. This looks an example of measles, and it keeps going down as we get better vaccination. This is polio. We completely eliminated smallpox, of course. The only reason that we still have polio in the world, and we've actually eliminated endemic, but I think that's out of date, because we've now eliminated, it's no longer endemic in Africa. And that's the wild type disease. I'm not quite sure what that says, but that says actually it's still spreading, and we've still got polio in Africa, but it's not the wild type disease anymore. So the only reason that we still have polio in Africa is because they had to be vaccinated with the lower cost vaccines. The two types of vaccine, there was one that basically killed the vaccine, and there was another kind of vaccine that inactivated it. And normally an inactivated vaccine like we have for measles works very well, but the inactivated vaccine for polio, which is very old technology, then very, very old vaccine now, 1950s I think, I'm not sure, that it had a flaw in it, that if you got the COVID vaccine, and then if the water wasn't, after it went through your intestinal system, then it got reactivated, sometimes, very rarely, and then if other people are drinking dirty water that the vaccine had got into, a live attenuated vaccine, then they could get polio, the serious disease again. And so the rest of the world, which could afford it, they all got the inactivated vaccine, which can't do that. But in Africa, sadly, they couldn't afford to roll out the inactivated vaccine, and they did manage to stop nearly all polio with the live attenuated vaccine, but they couldn't stop it completely. And that's the only reason we still have polio in the world. If it weren't for that, it would be called that smallpox. It's just a matter of finance, really. And they had the switch over, when they were going to switch over live attenuated to the killed version of the vaccine, but the funding just didn't come to give the killed version to everyone in Africa. And so they had to keep on, they had to stop that switch over and continue with the live attenuated version. It's really sad. So if it weren't for that, we would have got rid of polio already. The Gates Foundation has funded a new live attenuated version of the polio vaccine, which is under development and trials, which fixes that bug, and it is no longer able to start becoming serious again. So with that, then they will be able to vaccinate properly once that's approved and everything, and that is the way to end polio. We could also end polio by simply vaccinating everyone in Africa properly with the inactivated vaccine. If we would get the funding for that, then that would be a quicker way to end polio. And so one of the good things that's happening with this, we've got malaria eliminated for most countries, and the way it used to be. And one of the good things that's happening as a result of the COVID pandemic, as I said, we've got all these COVAX, not just COVAX being able to distribute them, but we've got India and South Korea, wherever that is, and we've got Brazil making vaccines. I can't remember, there are quite a number of countries that are making vaccines now. In fact, Brazil always was pretty good at making vaccines. Now, I think it's now making AstraZeneca vaccine. We've got very rapidly, and then we've got the mRNA hub that is being built in South Africa, which is going to make mRNA vaccines next year. So by this time next year, we've probably got South Africa making its own mRNA vaccines, not just for COVID, but also for malaria as well. They're hoping to develop a vaccine for malaria. And so this is a permanent change that I think that in the very far future, when people maybe 10,000 years from now, and they look back, they may look at 2022 as the year when the human beings first became civilized. Because to my mind, it's not civilized to have this vast inequity in food inequity as well. We have enough food at the end of this year to feed 2.6 billion people in excess for the entire year based on the grain surplus we have. And that could end, if that was distributed equitably, we could end child malnutrition throughout the world. Just immediately, if we could solve the economics and the politics and the distribution, we have plenty of food. And these things are going to be solved. I think the UN aims to reach zero hunger by 2030. It's certainly feasible technically and scientifically. We can get the politics and the funding behind it. And it looks like we're certainly heading towards much more equity for vaccines, where for a long time people have been dying in Africa from easily preventable diseases like measles, like polio, HIV, and they haven't got the treatment they have in the rest of the world. And the large numbers, hundreds of thousands of people are dying of HIV. And we've got tuberculosis. I think it's 1.3 million people die every year of tuberculosis. And 1.1 million die of tuberculosis every year at the moment. That's the biggest killer amongst all the infectious diseases. So worldwide. And yet, who dies of tuberculosis in the United Kingdom or in the United States? I haven't checked the figures, but it's very rare. So I think that we have made a permanent change here. That is, we still feel it acutely this year. It's so clear that they haven't got the vaccine yet in Africa. But previously it would have been a year or two before they could have got the vaccines, and maybe more. Now we've done it within a year, but they have also built up the capability to make their own vaccines, and I think that 2022 will be the last year where we can have this level of vaccine inequity that we had this year. So it's very sad when you're in the middle of it, but if we go forward, say 10,000 years from now, or 1,000 years from now, kind of Star Trek kind of perspective, when you're looking back, that was when, and they wouldn't be. I think Star Trek is very primitive technology. Really, they can't really imagine what future technology would be mixed up with other things that are probably flat out impossible, like their transporters, and then their other things that seem very incredibly primitive. But whatever technology they had back then, they would look at what we have now, and they look at it and they say they wouldn't be impressed by technology. These would seem not much more advanced over this stone axes and being able to make fire. But they might look back, and history would likely still be here, with records of our time on their internet and or whatever their equivalent is, and they'd look back and they'd say, this is the year when we first began to become civilized. I think this is a true civilization once you no longer have these huge inequities. I don't think you can call it a civilization, really, a proper advance. I don't think an extraterrestrial, I don't think that if you look at some other species on a very distant star in a different galaxy, then they wouldn't be civilized unless probably wouldn't really reach the state of true civilization until they got rid of such things as disease inequity and food inequity. It really isn't. It's really a very early stage of civilization, I think, that we are at with that perspective. But I think we're coming to the end of that. And then I just wanted to talk about, so the so if it was endemic at 10 times higher levels than measles, so in the United Kingdom, we have measles at about 1,000 cases a year, and we lost our measles-free status. So using vaccines, we eliminated measles as a local disease. And the United States are still measles-free, and indeed the entire Americas are measles-free as a local disease. It's always imported cases, so sometimes the outbreak can continue for months, and once nearly for a year. But in the United Kingdom, sadly, we have the same strain of measles that's been going on for several years, and there's about 1,000 cases a year. So there's no doubt at all that one way or another it somehow is continuing to circulate. So we have endemic measles in the United Kingdom, but we have almost no deaths from measles. It's very rare, because it's only running at 1,000 cases a year. Now, suppose that COVID eventually in the United Kingdom becomes 10 times the higher levels than measles. That would be a low-level endemic. It's just for instance, I'm not trying to predict, just to give you an idea of what low-level endemic means. Then that would be 10,000 cases a year and maybe 100 deaths a year with a good vaccine, and it could maybe go down to say 10 deaths a year. So, why did I say 100 deaths? I think my figure's a little bit strange there. It's much, if you got your vaccine, with your vaccines it'd be much more like 10 deaths a year. I'll have to rewrite that bit and think a little bit about my numbers. But so you get an idea, 10,000 people, maybe 10,000 people get COVID a year, maybe 10 deaths, and maybe, is it more than that? 10,000, 100, well anyway, it doesn't really matter. I'll try and get my numbers right, and I'm sorry I didn't check that properly. But this is the idea. So if you were down to 10,000 cases a year, and you had 100 deaths a year, suppose it was that would be considered low level, and we'd definitely consider the pandemic over. We could be at that stage by this time next year, with a good vaccine. We could be down to say 10,000 cases, 100 deaths a year, but we could be down much less than that, maybe 1,000 cases, and maybe just 1 death a year. And if you look at countries like New Zealand, then it could be like measles, which is about 1,000 cases, and then it's maybe 1 or 2 deaths a year. I'm not sure; it's not very many. And then if you look at New Zealand, because these new vaccines are coming along, there's so many of them. We expect many of them to be approved, and some of them may well be very good and better than Pfizer. Then, if you go and look, New Zealand is being very cautious. So is China, and they are not going to open up their borders this year. New Zealand is definitely not going to open up its borders in 2021. It's going to be, first of all, make sure everyone is vaccinated, then they're slowly going to let in only vaccinated people from countries that have already controlled their pandemic. So they wouldn't let even vaccinated people in from the United Kingdom if we were like this by this time next year, or even by say spring next year. If we're still like we are now, I don't think New Zealand would let us in, even vaccinated people. So they're going to, not to start with, they let them in little by little, vaccinate everyone, and by then the vaccines will be approved down to 6 months or something. So you can expect New Zealand to vaccinate I expect them to vaccinate all the way down to 6 months before they let significant numbers in, especially since the kids can vaccinate very quickly, because not so many years to vaccinate. So once if you're already vaccinated down to age 12, it's not many years to vaccinate all the way down to 6 months. And so I expect in practice for New Zealand to wait until all their kids are vaccinated, not letting COVID while they've got unvaccinated kids. They'd wait for and then by then there'd be really excellent vaccines coming along, and maybe much better, which they might well use as a booster or use for the people not yet vaccinated. And then they'd only let in vaccinated people to start with, and they would make sure they suppress every case, every outbreak as it happens. So right now, New Zealand has to lock down to stop an outbreak, but by the time they're nearly all vaccinated, then they would just do their very excellent test, trace, isolate, surge testing if necessary, tracing, the isolation in hotels. There's no reason why not to keep that up. And then people maybe wear masks, and that's about it. They probably wouldn't need to do lockdown of any sort. They might wear masks for a while if there's a local outbreak. And that might well be where the most careful countries would be by spring next year or summer next year, that they are all of them vaccinated down to babies, and that they suppress their outbreaks very quickly whenever they come. Where places like China, Taiwan, Bhutan, and North Korea, I don't believe that North Korea has lots of COVID, because why would they not want to send athletes to Japan? They're paranoid, very careful, very worried about sending athletes. They want to take part in the Olympic Games. They didn't because they were afraid of the vaccines of the athletes bringing back COVID. That is not consistent with a country that's rampant COVID. So I think North Korea has kept it out with a very strict border policy. Bhutan has. And then you've got, the last time I checked, and New Zealand, and then you've got Taiwan and China. I think these countries are going to be very, very cautious about letting it in. They'll wait until nearly everyone is vaccinated. So then, if we have really good vaccines, then they could stay COVID-free, just like many countries are measles-free. So now, when Dr. Van Kerkhove, when she did not say that any countries are going to be COVID-free. She just said it's going to be limited to particular geographic regions and not everywhere all the time. But last year, on 2 to December, they were talking about possibility of eliminating it. Really, it's the way that we just let it surge and spread, and these huge numbers we've got, and countries just obviously not going to try to eliminate it. And the World Health Organization has stopped talking like that. And they stopped in December 2020. It was the end of December. Actually, it was New Year's Day. I think it was the first time, New Year. Right, very beginning of the New Year was the first time they started saying they expected it to become endemic. Before that, they were saying it could be stopped. So now it's going to be. It looks like it's certainly going to be low level. It's hard to imagine eliminating it next year. But it could be low-level endemic by the end of next year if you look at the optimistic look, especially look at the vaccines, and if we keep up when we manage to make the vaccines that we can make next year. And I think we may well have areas that remain COVID-free. So China, these countries that already are, they might even stay COVID-free in sense of only having incoming outbreaks. We can't completely eliminate COVID from the world because it's in wild populations. It's probably might be in pangolins or whatever they are in China. It's definitely in deer in the United States, and it's in wild mink in the United States, I believe. So that would be very difficult to eradicate from the wild populations, the other wild populations around the world where it's got to certain animals. But it just matters, it's just a case of whether it comes back from those animals to human beings. And it hasn't jumped over to human beings again in China, because we would have noticed, because they noticed any outbreak of COVID in China. So wherever it came from originally, then either they've stopped it, maybe by shutting down the wildlife farms, they've stopped it, or it was very rare and it only happened very, very occasionally, because they trace back their outbreaks and they're always incoming cases, their outbreaks from the rest of the world. So although China probably does have a reservoir somewhere, and we don't know for sure, it could potentially have started in another Asian country where the bats are. It doesn't absolutely have to have started in China. It could have been imported wildlife from other countries, say, for instance. But wherever the reservoir was, it doesn't seem to jump over to humans easily in China. And then if it's the same with the other animal reservoirs, then that could then be that we just have to, maybe every few years you get an outbreak that comes over from the animal reservoir, and a bit like avian flu or something, and you would just vaccinate, might even be able to stop vaccinating if we could have eventually eliminated in humans. I'm not saying that we will, but suppose we could. So if we have a good enough vaccine, as good as the measles one is for measles, then I don't see why we can't eliminate COVID, but it does depend on having a good vaccine, because there are many countries that will not do the test, trace, isolate to the efficiency that's needed to eliminate it without a vaccine. So we do need a very good vaccine. But if we had a really excellent vaccine and we don't have too much vaccine hesitancy, then it might be eliminated. Disease you can eliminate, like measles. And then looking even further long term, then the main diseases that we have the tools to completely eradicate them. And mumps, I think that's gone from Finland, but it's in very few countries are already eliminated. Measles, polio, malaria, and river blindness, the main diseases that could be completely eradicated. And as we have less inequity for the various control measures, then we can gradually, and then some countries are eliminating, for instance, Guinea-worm disease is now free from 199 countries where it was originally. So step by step we are eliminating these deadly, these rather horrible diseases from various countries. And the others that could be eliminated as a public health problem, and there we have one that's yellow fever, is very like COVID. So yellow fever is oh no, sorry, that's I'm getting mixed up. That can be eradicated by eradicating the mosquito, which is the urban vector, and that also eradicates dengue fever. Sorry. I think there's an animal reservoir in monkeys for yellow fever, but if you can eradicate the mosquito, then it's not going to come to humans anyway. So there's just and there's HIV we could eradicate. We've got to work really hard on it, and we might be able to develop a vaccine against AIDS. That's a really difficult one. The big three are tuberculosis, HIV, and malaria. They're also very difficult to vaccinate against. And but it's not impossible to develop a vaccine against flu. Flu has a very low R naught, only a bit less than 1.5 quite often. And so it wouldn't take a very big increase if you had an 80% effective vaccine against flu. Then you're into a territory where you can think about eliminating it. And so with the huge research and then applying messenger RNA to flu and the huge advances we have in vaccines, just fast forward 10 years, I think it is possible that we may have completely eliminated several of these diseases. Remember, the only reason polio is because of the low-cost vaccines that we distributed in Africa, and with more we're putting more funding into public health as a result of the COVID thing. So short-term things are going to be really tough for a few months still, but it's in the stronger economies, the death and tragedy, quite a lot of that is now gone because not so many people are dying, and as we're going to have the vaccines, we're going to win the race against the vaccines. We can actually, this is in there, I talked about how once we have the vaccine supply, you look at the United States and you think, oh, the United States and United Kingdom, we did it so fast, within so many months, vaccinating the entire country, just in only 6 months or something. Well, in Bhutan, they did the first dose in 11 days, vaccinated everyone in Bhutan. And in Brazil, their childhood vaccination, I think it was it polio? One of their vaccines, they vaccinated all the children, and I have to go through there and find the details, but they vaccinated all the children in Brazil in 1 day, way back a few decades ago. So it is possible to vaccinate much faster, and weaker economies can do it. Bhutan, very mountainous, not an easy place. And what you can do in a small country like Bhutan, you can divide big countries into lots of small countries, as Brazil showed. So we have the vaccine supply, and we need to build up the infrastructure to get it out to people. We need to deal with the vaccine hesitancy, and then we need to deal with the infodemic, and then we can potentially have people vaccinated throughout the world very quickly, and get the very best vaccines once we have really good second and third generation vaccines. There's no reason in principle, nothing scientific, nothing technological, nothing in terms of sociology, in terms of human behavior. It's really politics and economics, and if you've got the will for it, you can find a way to adapt that as well, as we found. Then we can be we can be in a good situation very quickly next year. And the weaker economies, they've got so much vaccine now, they're overflowing with vaccine, and by the end of this year they just have far more vaccine than they need. Billions of extra doses, I think it's 2 or 3 billion doses excess that they will have by the end of this year. It's quite an extraordinary number. So some of that is definitely going to go to the rest of the world. And then we've got the build-up in, so I do see things as looking really positive in the long term. But it's not going to happen by the disease just going away by itself. Just learning to live with COVID and not getting vaccinated and not doing anything much except just letting all our kids have it, like it's happening in the United Kingdom, where they're just letting it run through all the kids. And they seem to think that this is good for some reason. And we get our chief medical officer and so on saying we think that about half the kids have already had COVID and the rest are going to get it in the next few months. And he's not even saying, we shouldn't let this happen. And there's very little discussion on the BBC. It's just become a kind of consensus thing in the United Kingdom where I live, where people just have come to believe that all the kids are going to get COVID and there's nothing you can do about it. And that's so far from the truth. And we can, and once so we can expect all the kids in the United Kingdom, nearly all the kids in the United Kingdom are going to have had COVID by the end of this year. Doesn't seem to be much that's going to stop that. And but we can still vaccinate them and stop them getting it again, because there's no real reason to expect that subsequent waves will be less virulent. And for some reason COVID has been remarkably non-virulent amongst kids, but especially with very little vaccination in kids, it wants to spread amongst kids, so it's going to spread and become more infectious in kids. And what's that going to do to its virulence in kids? Because there's no downside, remember there's no downside to the virus to become more virulent. There's very little downside because it's not infected at that stage. Another reason why there's no downside to become more virulent is only a small fraction is actually going to die or get, and if that fraction is only a fraction of a percent, and it's becoming more infectious, if it's becoming like 10% more effective, more infectious in 99 people, and the other one dies before it can infect anyone, and that's a benefit for the virus as well. It's going to spread much faster if it's like that. So that's another thing about the way that COVID works, that because it's so very uneven in how it affects people, then it can become more virulent. That's another reason, as well as the deaths not happening until much later. So we don't know. It's a new disease. It's evolving. It's changing. It's incredibly adaptive, incredibly very strange and complicated disease. It's hugely complex in how it evades the immune system. It basically disables it and even co-opts cells that try to kill it into part of these virus factories. And we don't want this to continue evolving. We really, really don't want to encourage this to evolve and just see where it goes. What we want to do is to stop it, and use vaccines to stop it and drive transmission down. We really, really don't want to see whether the experts are right, that it will become more virulent and how much more virulent it will become, or whether it will become mild over years, decades or centuries. That's an experiment we don't want to do. So we will, my sincere hope is that we never find the answers to what those experts are saying. We never find out if it's going to become more severe. If we live with it for the next decade, will it become more severe or will it become milder? I hope we never find out. I hope we keep numbers so low that it's no longer generating new variants. You get a new variant, the first four were every, I can remember, 25 million cases, I think they were. And since then we've had more than 100 million, I can't remember how many we've had since then, without any new variants, very noticeable. So hopefully, if we can keep cases low, then we can manage to stop it evolving to these new variants, and hopefully we will just never find out where it will eventually evolve to, if we just learn to live with it. And so I think the United Kingdom has this, they're going to learn to live with it, but they are eventually, I'm sure, once once the vaccines are approved down to kids and the rest of the world are doing it, the United Kingdom is very late at going down to 12. It'll probably be very late going down to 6 months, but I think eventually they will do it. Maybe later this year, maybe early next year. And once you've got that, then it's going to be much easier to control. And then better vaccines. And so even the countries that are saying they're going to live with it, I don't think it's going to be a big hyper-endemic disease by this time next year. Because the vaccines, mainly because the vaccines are getting so good. And we also have good therapeutics as well coming along. It's much harder to develop therapeutics because it's such a complex disease. And it's all these things it does to your immune system and all the organs it affects. Just about every body in the human organ in the human body is affected. It's very difficult to treat. So it's not surprising that it's difficult to find good therapeutics to treat it once it's started. But we are making advances in those too. And so, especially like artificial antibodies, there are several hundred therapeutics being looked at too. And hopefully we've had, bit by bit, we've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, is it 4 or 5 therapeutics we now have that reduce it by some extent. And so that's going to get better too. You expect that to take longer than the vaccines in this particular case, because it's such a complex and difficult and intricate and difficult disease to treat. And but we have new therapeutics coming along as well, and therapeutics specifically designed for COVID as well. So that's going to happen too at sometime coming into next year. So hopefully this isn't. So this is really all very positive. It's going to become mild like flu, mild like a cold. It may well come mild like a cold, but not by. We can't rely on it to do it by itself. There've been plenty of really deadly diseases like polio and smallpox that never did that, but we can make it so because the vaccines are so good. And so that, and just continue, be careful, and if you've got high levels of transmission wherever you are, be careful and do it all, get vaccinated, do all the other measures, and we will get through this. And this time, remember, this is it seems huge to us, but compared with the 1900s, if you could take someone in a time machine from 1900 to the present day, then they would be astonished at how little deadly disease we have from infectious diseases now. And this is a little bit of a glitch up, where COVID has become another deadly disease that is worse than flu indeed. It's been the leading cause of death in some countries. But compared to what it was back then, it's still a huge reduction, and we are soon going to be over this one way or another. And sometime in the next year, we're going to be over this, hugely over it. And I'm very optimistic. We're given the and World Health Organization, they talk about that we can do it. It's all there. We've got all the tools. We've got everything there. We've just got to use them and help other people, encourage other people, and working together with solidarity, then we can get over this, and we can get over it faster the more we work together and help each other to get through this.